Thank you to Appel and Book 2.0 for this wonderful opportunity to kick off the second part of the program today. It's time now to focus on linking the books and stories you love with confronting one of the most pressing challenges of our time, climate change. In this session, we're going to explore the climate impact of books through the insights generated by a new study published today on the carbon footprint of the Portuguese publishing sector. Climate change now affects every continent on Earth. Extreme weather is bringing heavy rains, floods, wind, and heat right to our doorsteps. First, for all of us in the room today, it's no longer some sort of distant concern, it's our immediate reality. So what exactly is climate change and what are we trying to do? Well, scientists like to explain it, and I love this analogy, like an overflowing bathtub. The tub representing the Earth's atmosphere is filling up with water, greenhouse gases, twice as fast as it can drain. And that means that over time, the overall level of water is rising, much like the greenhouse gas accumulating in our atmosphere, causing global warming. And today, that bathtub is overflowing. We're emitting more greenhouse gases than the Earth can absorb. And ultimately, what we need to do is try and get that balance right. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible and enable the remaining amount to be balanced out through our forests, our oceans, and through new technology, a concept and goal referred to as net zero. And our leaders are behind this. The Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, signalled a legal obligation for UN members, that includes the European Union and Portugal, to not only reduce emissions, but to track, monitor, and report on their progress as they strive to become net zero by the end date of 2050. And unfortunately for us, the solutions needed today to get us to the net zero are not as simple as just turning off the tap. What we're facing today and the solutions are better visualized like a flood. You may have heard my accent. I'm Australian, I grew up in the suburbs of Sydney, and I can paint you a pretty picture about floods. You see, during the 80s, I've lived through two major floods. This was the first. You can tell it's the 80s, check out that fashion sense. And basically, what Sydney experienced was something that we hear on the news every day, a once-in-a-lifetime storm, heavy rainfall, and the bank of the nearby creek burst. It sent a 2-metre wall of water rushing through Sydney, and it flooded around 1,000 residential properties, my childhood home included. I remember seeing my toys swirl and dance around in my living room. And I also remember being put on the highest point of the house at the time, which was my mother's 80s kitchen green Formica countertop, as my dad and the neighbours rushed out to try and kick the back fence down to let the water go through. And the point of my story is really to give you a powerful metaphor to how climate change is going to affect the publishing industry. It gives you a sense of the scale of what we're facing, particularly as new regulations come into effect. It's also about understanding the awareness and the actions needed, not just from big companies, but from absolutely everybody within the industry, across all our organizations and across all our supply chains. And what I like about the flood metaphor is that it's not just about scale, it's about solutions. In the aftermath of a flood, the first thing you do is figure out what on earth just happened. You also then need to identify the weak points in the infrastructure and the drainage, and you have to try and reinforce them. And ultimately, you have to work together. Solutions require everyone to be moving in the same direction and towards the same goal. And that's exactly the type of approach that climate action needs in our industry. This time last year, I was on the stage with Antonio, the CEO from the Navigator company, and we were discussing climate, and we were discussing sustainability, and we were discussing digital, and we were discussing print. And afterwards, we got chatting, and we realized that we wanted to turn that talk into concrete action. And the idea was simple: create a baseline that would measure the overall carbon impact of the publishing sector in Portugal. And to do that, we wanted to use a carbon footprint study. And this would give us an initial number, which is always good. Numbers are always good. But crucially, we would talk to people in the book supply chain and better understand the drivers, the weak points, to understand how collectively we can work together to accelerate greater carbon reductions. And I'm happy to report, in just 1 year, I'm back and I have some results. The first thing this study tells us is an overall number. In 2023, we estimated that the general Portuguese publishing market generated just under 10,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is around 0.017% of Portugal's overall annual carbon emissions. And for most of you, some people actually who work in this every day, this won't mean very much to you at all. So let's put it into context. It means that for the average book produced and sold in Portugal, there's around 550 grams of carbon. And that's roughly the equivalent of driving 5 kilometres down the road in a new passenger car, and it's the equivalent of watching or binge watching your favourite new series for around 15 hours. And it tells us two really important things. The first one is publishing is not a highly carbon intensive market. It's not a significant driver of emissions within Portugal. And this makes sense. Publishing is not manufacturing. It's not construction, and it also doesn't need some radical technological solution like biofuel, like the aviation industry. The second one, and arguably the most important one, is that the main impact this publishing industry can make is in creating the platforms to showcase the stories, the information, and to inspire action in support of climate action. But, and there's always a but, small is mighty. Whilst the overall carbon impact is small, it doesn't let us off the hook. And what I also learned from the study is that the Portuguese publishing sector understand the ethical responsibility to act now. The solutions to ensure the books you love also love the planet already exist. And by being a small market, the Portuguese publishing market can move faster, be more agile, particularly if we think about bigger markets like the UK and the US, which have a whole different set of issues to overcome. So how can the Portuguese market move faster? To start, what you can measure, you can change. There is no industry standard around quantifying the carbon impact of publishing just yet. I'm working really hard on it. The study provides an initial methodology, a starting point, and we definitely found out that collecting this type of information is really hard. Sometimes the data doesn't exist, sometimes it's outdated, and sometimes it's just hard to collect and aggregate, and that's okay. Our hope is that this study will inspire a collective dialogue to continue to estimate, refine, and evolve our calculations as we collect and report on carbon data in subsequent years. And this leads to the second insight, the important role publishers play. For the Portuguese market, most of the emissions are embedded in the book supply chain, and they're associated with the actual production of the book. Things like paper, printing, and other materials like the inks, the bindings, and the glue. Which makes sense. This is where the raw materials are used and where the energy needed to convert these into the physical product lies. And this aligns with other industry studies where most of the emissions are going to be associated with the raw materials and the production processes. It was interesting to note that publishers only account for about 6% of emissions themselves. But what those numbers don't show you is that publishers have a lot of indirect impact in the supply chain. Decisions around book formats, print runs, paper types are driven by publishers and editorial teams, and these affect emissions associated with book production. And these decisions matter, especially if we think that books are long-lasting. For books that remain unsold, our studies show that they can be in the market for between 7 to 10 years, far longer than the latest fashion trend or the newest electric gadget. The dynamics between moving stock in and out of warehouses to retailers will be publisher specific, but reflect broader Portuguese book buying trends. And these show strong demand for seasonal book buying, think example, your Christmas list, pricing discounts, bestsellers and new releases. And this also means that the books produced in 2025 may still be in a publisher's warehouse somewhere in 2032 and beyond. And I think this shows that publishers are in a critical position to advocate for sustainability in the supply chain, particularly in areas of book design and distribution. But there is another group that have a shared responsibility to act and who are not visible in these numbers: the authors and the readers. If you consider an individual book, by picking it up and flipping through the pages, it's impossible to tell that that publisher who did the book has a net zero target, or that they installed LED lights in their office buildings. It's almost impossible to tell that the paper mill or the printer has energy-efficient machines, or perhaps runs on renewable energy. For the reader and the author, these actions are intangible, and what matters to them is the climate impact of their specific book. Better carbon data across the supply chain opens up the possibility of creating carbon data at an individual book level. And this helps to quantify the carbon impact in a transparent and tangible way. For authors, this can mean that you can bring sustainability to the table when you're considering how your book should be designed. For readers, it's better understanding the climate impact of the industry and their purchase to help empower your decisions. And it gives an inspiration to prolong the shelf life of a book, perhaps passing that book on, or understanding that once it's ripped and worn and well-loved, how to recycle that, or the nearest way to give it away or donate. Now, I recognise that things like this, carbon labels, might be a way off, but we are doing loads of really interesting pilots, particularly at the international level. And here you can see an initial prototype. Feel free to scan that code on your phone, and you can see the climate impact of the first ones are 3 Elsevier books, and the big one that you can see there is a Portuguese example. And remember, this isn't about labeling one book as being sustainable and one book as not being sustainable. This is about bringing the authors and the readers into this discussion. It's about empowering publishing and editorial to proactively place sustainability in a tangible way alongside other considerations I heard earlier this morning: marketing, sales, making sustainability part of that discussion. And this brings me back to the metaphor of a flood. Because while I understand that quantifying the carbon impact of publishing is technical, at times super detailed, and it's a massive challenge, it's also a huge opportunity to play our part. When I think back to my experiences of living through a flood, I don't remember any of the scary parts, but I do remember having been rescued by my neighbour in Speedos, hoisted up onto his shoulders, and taken to a surfboard and floated down the river. For me, it was an adventure, and that's what addressing climate change should be. It's our collective adventure. Often, our industry can be characterised as slow or old-fashioned or traditional, but this study has demonstrated that we are trailblazers, and we're ready to try new approaches. We can start the conversation, and we can create insightful and really practical solutions that will help us decarbonise. And this is because we've got some really cool people who work with me. Pedro from the Navigator company, who's in the audience, Jeremy from my company, who's done the modelling, Bernardo from Leia, who had to supply a lot of carbon data. The time to act is now, and we need more people to be involved. We need to improve the study, we need to accelerate actions. And while I'm personally 100% dedicated to the cause, I look forward to seeing this conversation continue at platforms like Book 2.0. And who knows, perhaps at the next Lisbon Book Fair, you might be scrolling down and see a few QR codes when you're going through the avenue of books. Thank you very much.